You are scrolling through your phone right now. So was he, 16 years old, a cousin beside him, a 12-hour drive still ahead of them. On the screen, a video of strangers wading into the sea, climbing over rocks, disappearing into a city that looked, from a distance, like any other city. He watched it 3 times. Then he made a decision that would put him on the losing end of one of the strangest migrations in modern history. But the real answer to why he did it is far stranger than the headlines let on. Because this isn't really a story about a border. It's a story about 8 kilometers of land that has been lied to for 600 years. Look at a map. Just 8 kilometers of coastline separate the tip of Africa from a piece of Europe that never left. That's it. 8 kilometers and an ocean's worth of difference in passport, currency, and fate. The place is called Ceuta, and geography has been playing a joke on it since before Rome existed. The Phoenicians landed here first, and they gave it a name, Abila. To the Greeks, this rocky outcrop and the mountain across the strait in Spain formed the Pillars of Hercules, the edge of the known world, the place where the gods supposedly tore a continent in half just to let the ocean through. The Romans came next, and they called it Septem Fratres, the 7 brothers, after the hills that rise behind the coastline like sentries. Every empire that touched the Mediterranean wanted this rock. Do you understand why yet? Because whoever holds Ceuta holds the door, not a metaphorical door, an actual physical choke point between 2 continents, 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest crossing. In the year 711, Islamic forces launched their conquest of Iberia from this exact stretch of coastline, using Ceuta as a springboard that would put Muslim rule over most of Spain for the next 700 years. The city has never once, in its entire recorded history, belonged only to itself. It has always belonged to whoever controlled the strait. Then, in August of 1415, a fleet of 200 ships and roughly 45,000 men sailed out of Lisbon. At their head was King John I of Portugal, a monarch obsessed with turning his small, poor kingdom into something greater. His sons went with him, including a young prince who would later be nicknamed Henry the Navigator, a name that would go on to launch the entire age of European exploration. They landed at dawn on August 21st, stormed the beach, and by nightfall the city had fallen. Ceuta became the very first overseas territory of a European empire, not a trading post, not a colony in the way we'd later understand the word, a conquest, planted on African soil that would outlive the empire that built it. Here's the part that should stop you cold. Portugal eventually lost Ceuta's rival cities up and down the coast. Tangier fell back. Other footholds crumbled, but Ceuta held. Even when Portugal itself was swallowed by Spain for 60 years during a dynastic union, even when Portuguese rebels threw off Spanish rule in 1640 and won their independence back, the people of Ceuta looked at a map, looked at their neighbors, and chose to stay Spanish. In 1668, the Treaty of Lisbon made it official. Portugal formally handed the city to the Spanish crown, and that is the strange hinge on which this whole story turns. A European city on the African continent, kept not by force alone, but by the choice of the people living in it 400 years ago to remain on the European side of a line that barely existed yet. The city paid for that choice for centuries. Armies from the surrounding region laid siege to its walls again and again, at one point for more than 3 decades straight, the longest siege in recorded history, and still it did not fall. By the middle of the 19th century, a war between Spain and its neighbors redrew the map one more time. The Treaty of Wadras in 1860 fixed the modern boundaries of the enclave almost exactly where they sit today. Read that again. The line on the ground right now, the one people died trying to cross this summer, was drawn by diplomats in a treaty room 166 years ago. Nobody who actually lives along that line today had any say in where it was placed. Isn't that always how borders work? Because that's the thing nobody tells you about this border. For most of its history, it wasn't a border at all. Not really. For centuries, the line between Ceuta and the rest of Morocco was something families walked across the way you'd walk across a street. Traders carried goods on their backs, back and forth, generation after generation. Whole villages depended on it. Right up until relatively recently, thousands of Moroccan porters, many of them women carrying loads that could crush a grown man, crossed daily through a checkpoint called Tarajal, hauling tax-free Spanish merchandise into Morocco to sell. It was brutal, underpaid, dangerous work. People died in the crushes at that gate, but it was also, for entire communities, the only economy they had. Then in 2019, that crossing was closed, permanently. The informal trade that had fed thousands of households simply ended almost overnight. Picture what that actually meant on the ground. Mothers who had spent 20 years hauling 50-kilo bundles on their backs day after day suddenly had nothing. No severance, no transition, no new industry waiting to absorb them. Just silence where a livelihood used to be. Ask an economist what happens when you remove the only source of income from a border region without replacing it with anything else, and they'll give you a very predictable answer. You get desperation, and desperation, given enough time, always finds a door. So picture the coastline now. Same 8 kilometers, same rocks the Phoenicians once named, same strait Prince Henry once sailed. Only now there's a fence, cameras, patrol boats, and on one side a Spanish city with European wages, and on the other Moroccan towns where a huge share of the population is under 30, and watching every single day videos of a life that exists just past the wire. That's where the anthropologist Miriam Aura comes in. She spent years studying exactly this kind of movement, and her research points somewhere uncomfortable. It isn't just poverty pushing young people toward that fence. It's the feeling of being deliberately shut out of a door that used to be open. Economic hardship on one side, a hardening, ever more selective entry system on the other. Put those two pressures against a population raised entirely on smartphones, and you get something combustible. In July of 2026, it ignited. A ruling came down from Spain's Supreme Court, a narrow technical decision about how quickly migrants intercepted right at the border fence could be sent back. Within days, that ruling had been twisted, stretched, and rumored into something it never actually said. Posts spread across Moroccan social media claiming the border was, in effect, open. Practical advice followed: which beaches, which hours, which currents were safest to swim, and people believed it. Not because they were foolish, but because belief was the only currency they had left. Think about what it takes to believe a rumor, enough to risk your life on it. You have to have already run out of better options. That's the part the panic headlines never quite capture. Over a single week, an estimated 60,000 people attempted to cross into Ceuta. 60,000 converging on 8 kilometers of coastline that Phoenician sailors once treated as the edge of the world. They swam around breakwaters in the dark. They scrambled over rocks slick with salt water. They climbed a fence never designed to hold back a crowd that size. And in the chaos, dozens of people died. Some drowned. Some were crushed against the barriers by the sheer weight of the crowd behind them. Search teams spent days afterward pulling bodies from the water near a coastline that has been fought over, sold, seeded, and fortified for over 2,000 years, and had never once, in all that time, seen a human tide quite like this. Spanish officials counted at least 67 confirmed dead, though some local authorities put the number far higher. Moroccan officials, counting differently, reported barely a tenth of that figure. Human rights monitors said the truth was probably worse than either number, closer to 130, once you counted the bodies, quietly recovered from the water in the weeks before the crisis made headlines at all. Numbers like that stop meaning anything after a while. So think instead about one beach, one breakwater, thousands of bodies pressed against each other in darkness, water on one side, stone and steel on the other, everyone trying to move forward at once. That is not a statistic. That is a crowd crush with an ocean attached to it. Within 48 hours, something almost as strange happened. Most of them turned around and walked back. Tens of thousands, gone as quickly as they had arrived. Not because they'd been defeated exactly, but because the city they'd risked their lives to reach had no shelter for them, no work waiting, nothing but forest to sleep in and police lines to face. One young man, asked by a reporter why he'd come at all, said simply that he honestly didn't know anymore, and that he was going home. Multiply that quiet, exhausted confession by 60,000, and you start to understand what actually happened on that coastline. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a plot. it was thousands of individual 16-year-olds with a cousin, a rumor, and a phone, all making the same desperate calculation at the same moment in history. Spain responded the way empires guarding a choke point have always responded. Barriers went up in the water itself. A floating wall stretched across the very breakwaters people had swum around. 600 years after King John I planted a flag on the shore to control who passed through the strait, his descendants' descendants were still building things in the water to control exactly the same thing.